Before the war, a new force was created in Germany with a clear objective: to exterminate internal enemies. It was not born on the battlefield, but in the concentration camps. Its members were not ordinary soldiers. They were guards trained to obey without question and to kill without remorse. Under the command of Theodor Eicke, the Totenkopfverbände was consolidated as the shock force of the Nazi regime. The selection was brutal. Age, height, racial purity, and ideological fanaticism were mandatory. Their training included physical punishment, systematic humiliation, and political indoctrination. Their symbol, the skull, ceased to represent military valor and became the mark of organized terror. Why did Hitler and Himmler bet on turning jailers into a military force? What distinguished them from the regular Wehrmacht troops? And how would their training in the camps influence their brutality on the battlefield? Forged in blood, the deadly birth of the Totenkopf. The history of the Totenkopf division begins not on battlefields but in the dark corridors of the Third Reich's concentration camps. The skull and crossbones symbol, far from being a Nazi innovation, had roots in military traditions dating back to the 18th century. Elite Prussian regiments, Russian troops during the First World War, and even Polish units had used variations of this emblem to represent valor, sacrifice, and a contemptuous familiarity with death. However, under the Nazi regime, it would acquire an entirely different meaning. Theodor Eicke, a veteran of the First World War and an early member of the Nazi Party, had fallen into disgrace in the early 1930s due to episodes of emotional instability and internal disputes. His redemption came when Heinrich Himmler, then the emerging head of the SS, identified him as the ideal man to reorganize the German concentration camp system. In 1933, after the Reichstag fire, while detention centers for the regime's political enemies were being established, Eicke received command of the Dachau camp, which he would turn into a model for the entire system. Eicke's methodology transformed Dachau through a system of relentless military discipline. Guards who did not demonstrate absolute obedience were expelled without hesitation. To him, his subordinates were not mere jailers but political soldiers of the new Germany. In 1934, as part of his reforms, he selected the Totenkopf emblem as the symbol of his special force, the perfect representation of their mission: to be the instrument of death for the internal enemy. The new unit was formally named SS Totenkopfverbände, SS Death's Head Units. Under his leadership, a system was established where the guards were organized into 6 battalions, each assigned to one of the operational camps, named according to their respective regions: SS Oberbefehlshaber for Dachau, SS Brandenburg for Sachsenhausen, and SS Thüringen for the extensive Buchenwald camp. The selection criteria for the guards exceeded even the strict standards of other SS formations. On the 4th of October of 1932, Himmler had established 2 fundamental conditions for joining the SS: to be tall men with excellent racial features and to meet specific physical criteria such as a minimum height of 1.7 meters and a maximum age of 30 years. When Hitler came to power in 1933, the flood of applications allowed Himmler to raise these standards even further. Minimum height of 1.74 meters, maximum age reduced to 23 years, and perfect eyesight mandatory. A police certificate of good conduct was also required. For the Totenkopfverbände, the demands were even more extreme. Age between 17 and 22 years, minimum height of 1.78 meters, exhaustive medical tests, and genealogical documentation proving racial purity going back at least to 1750. These rigorous requirements, as noted by historian Charles Sidner, reinforced the perception of the SS as an exclusive order within the Nazi hierarchy. Sepp Dietrich, commander of the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, even stipulated that his recruits must not have a single dental filling. Unlike the Wehrmacht, where technical competence was valued, in the Totenkopfverbände, ideological loyalty and racial fanaticism were paramount. Brutalization was part of the training: exhausting exercises, ritual humiliations, collective punishments, and incessant political indoctrination. This process transformed the guards into insensitive men, convinced of their superior mission and ready to obey orders without question. En 1936, Hitler oficialmente autorizó la expansión de las Fuerzas Armadas de la SS. Himmler seized the opportunity to increase the Totenkopfverbende's strength from 1,800 to 3,500 men. In a carefully worded decree, he allowed these units to form a permanent armed force for internal police tasks and the custody of enemies of the Reich. However, Himmler and Eicke interpreted this authorization as the seed of a future political army capable of competing with the Wehrmacht in power and prestige. To avoid provoking the military high command, the Totenkopf officially remained under the administrative jurisdiction of the SS Main Economic and Administrative Office, WVHA, a bureaucratic maneuver to conceal their true purpose. Funding came through the Interior Ministry, ensuring they would not appear as a rival force to the regular army. The Anschluss, annexation of Austria in 1938, provided the first opportunity for the Totenkopfverbände to act outside the camps. The battalions marched through Vienna and other cities, not as military conquerors but as ideological occupation forces. This deployment reinforced their reputation as relentless fanatics. That same year, a fourth regiment was formed, SS Totenkopfstandarte Ostmark, in charge of guarding the newly established Mauthausen camp near Linz. As Hitler's foreign policy became more aggressive, Himmler strategically positioned the armed SS as an integral component of the German security apparatus. In a declaration from 1936, he proclaimed, "The role of the SS is to guarantee the security of Germany from within, just as the Wehrmacht guarantees security from without." This vision resonated with Hitler, who by then had consolidated his control over the armed forces through personal oaths of loyalty. During the Sudeten crisis in 1938, Himmler exploited a legal loophole in the official provisions. The regulations established that, in case of mobilization, the camps would be guarded by older members of the Allgemeine SS, freeing up the motorized Totenkopf units to function as a specialized police force under his direct command. On the 15th of October, he issued an emergency order for police reinforcement, activating reservists to take control of the camps. This measure allowed him to bypass limitations imposed by Hitler and significantly expand the Totenkopf force. By mid-1939, the Totenkopfverbände had grown to approximately 22,000 men, equipped with thousands of weapons, from pistols to heavy machine guns. This threefold growth in less than a year represented an extraordinary achievement, but also posed enormous logistical challenges to Eicke's organization. The balance between military preparation, ideological indoctrination, and operational effectiveness consumed unprecedented resources. In May of 1939, Hitler formalized the size of the Totenkopfverbände at 14,000 men, with authorization to expand up to 25,000 in case of mobilization. The rapid expansion of the SS in preparation for war forced modifications to the strict recruitment standards. In December of 1938, Himmler acknowledged that the demands of expansion required compromises, allowing minor physical defects as long as they were not of a racial or eugenic nature. This adjustment marked the beginning of a change in the identity of the SS, which transitioned from an exclusive force to a more broadly recruited organization. By August of 1939, with war imminent, Himmler ordered the activation of all reserve units. The concentration camps of Dachau, Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen and Mauthausen were reconverted into logistical centers, where the Totenkopf units were equipped for imminent deployment. After years of preparation in the grim confines of the concentration system, Eicke's men were ready to carry the terror learned in the camps to the battlefields of Europe. Baptism of blood, the Totenkopf unleashed in Poland and France. On the 1st of September of 1939, German armored columns crossed the Polish border, unleashing the war that would consume Europe for 6 years. Among the formations advancing alongside the Wehrmacht, the regiments of the Waffen-SS represented the ideological vanguard of the Nazi regime. The Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler and the SS Verfügungstruppe Deutschland immediately engaged in the campaign, while the Germania Regiment remained in reserve. For the Totenkopfverbände, the invasion marked a fundamental turning point in its evolution. The three original Totenkopf regiments, Oberbayern, Brandenburg and Thüringen, were ordered to leave their barracks in Dachau, Sachsenhausen and Buchenwald, respectively, for a special mission in Poland. Hitler had specifically arranged for these units to operate behind the front lines, securing supply routes, pacifying occupied territories, and eliminating any pockets of resistance. This transition from camp guards to a military occupation force represented the realization of Eicke's vision, to transform his men from jailers into soldiers of the German racial empire. Unlike regular soldiers, the men of the Totenkopf acted under a moral code profoundly altered by years of ideological indoctrination. They did not consider themselves mere military men, but political soldiers, tasked with imposing the Reich's racial and political order. In Polish towns, their arrival marked the beginning of systematic terror campaigns. Historical records document planned looting, mass deportations, and summary executions. The brutality was not accidental, but an intrinsic part of their method, to sow terror in order to consolidate domination. In the Bydgoszcz region, the Brandenburg Regiment executed 800 suspect Poles in just 2 days. The brutal behavior triggered formal complaints from the regular army, all dismissed by the Nazi hierarchy. The methods applied in the concentration camps were transferred intact to the battlefield. Absolute disregard for the conventions of war, systematic dehumanization of the enemy, and an immediate propensity for lethal force. The SS Totenkopfverbände actively participated in the planned destruction of the Polish intellectual elite. Under Action AB, Außerordentliche Befriedungsaktion, thousands of university professors, priests, doctors, and retired officers were arrested and executed in a deliberate attempt to culturally decapitate the Polish nation. Totenkopf units also collaborated with the Einsatzgruppen in the persecution of Polish Jews, participating in pogroms, synagogue burnings, and selective killings. Following this bloody initiation, in November of 1939, Hitler authorized the combination of the various Totenkopf regiments to form a third SS division. The new formation faced serious disciplinary issues despite Eicke's brutal enforcement of obedience. During the first months of 1940, the unit underwent intensive training to transform into a motorized division. The shortage of vehicles and heavy equipment forced Eicke to improvise and request material from various sources to complete regulatory provisions. In October of 1939, the creation of the first 3 official SS divisions, Verfügung, later Das Reich, Polizei, and Totenkopf, represented a qualitative leap for Himmler's military ambitions. These formations were designated as motorized divisions, theoretically among the most advanced units of the German army. In reality, motorization was more aspirational than effective. Most Wehrmacht divisions still fundamentally depended on animal transport and foot marches. To form the Totenkopf division, Eicke introduced significant modifications compared to the standard army structure. He organized the division around 3 motorized infantry regiments instead of the usual 2 in Wehrmacht formations. The additional personnel came from existing Totenkopfverbände regiments, and the artillery regiment was completed mainly with men from the SS Heimwehr Danzig, a militia that had participated in the invasion of Poland. Anticipating the inevitable casualties of war, Himmler established a system of replacement battalions within the concentration camp network. Each Totenkopf regiment received a dedicated battalion, with a company assigned to each operational battalion. This system ensured a continuous flow of ideologically compatible reinforcements. The division was initially assigned to the reserve of the Second Army for the Western invasion. A week after operations began, it received combat orders. Advancing through southern Holland and Belgium toward France, it encountered significant resistance northeast of Cambrai. On the 19th of May of 1940, Eicke was instructed to prepare against enemy counterattacks from the north and was subsequently directed by the 15th Panzer Corps toward the Cambrai area, where Rommel's 7th Panzer Division was facing intense French pressure. Eicke deployed his 1st Infantry Regiment under the command of Standartenführer Max Simon, reinforced with anti-tank companies, engineers, and artillery. The regiment's advance across the Scarpa River toward Cambrai and Arras encountered fierce resistance, particularly from French-Moroccan troops. House-to-house fighting in several towns was brutal but successful for the Totenkopf, which managed to dislodge the defenders and repel subsequent armored counterattacks. By the 20th of May, they had secured the areas north and east of Cambrai, capturing 16,000 prisoners and abundant war material, allowing the 15th Panzer Corps to continue its advance. The division's initial combat casualties were 16 dead and 53 wounded, while claiming to have eliminated approximately 200 Moroccan soldiers. Simultaneously, elements of the 2nd Panzer Division reached the English Channel, effectively isolating 40 Allied divisions, almost 1 million men, from the main French forces to the south. This strategic corridor, although vulnerable due to its narrow width, 50 to 65 kilometers, required immediate consolidation. Totenkopf was positioned between the 8th Panzer Division to the south and Rommel's 7th to the north, with the mission of preventing any attempt at reconnection between separated Allied forces. For 10 days of intense fighting between the 19th and 29th of May, the division suffered 1,140 casualties, including 300 officers, a severe blow to its command structure and operational effectiveness. Himmler, recognizing the need to keep the division functional, sent 300 partially trained cadets from Bad Tölz as reinforcements. In this critical phase occurred one of the most infamous episodes associated with the division, the Le Paradis massacre. On the 27th of May of 1940, the 14th Company of the 2nd Battalion under the command of SS Hauptsturmführer Fritz Knöchlein captured approximately 100 British soldiers from the 2nd Battalion of the Royal Norfolk Regiment. After surrendering, the prisoners were taken to a barn lined up against a wall and systematically machine-gunned. Survivors were finished off with bayonets. Only 2 soldiers, Albert Pooley and William O'Callaghan, survived by hiding beneath the corpses of their comrades. Their later testimonies would document this war crime. News of the atrocity spread quickly among nearby German units. General Erich Höpner, the German commander in France, expressed his determination to remove Knöchlein if prisoner executions were confirmed. However, investigations were fruitless, possibly due to Knöchlein's claim that the British had used dum-dum ammunition, prohibited by the Hague Convention of 1899. This accusation, if true, rendered the British unlawful combatants who forfeited protections as prisoners of war. From the 14th of June, after the collapse of French defences, Totenkopf participated in the relentless pursuit of retreating forces south of the Marne. Organised resistance had mostly collapsed. The remaining engagements came from local commanders attempting to delay the inevitable. Near Dijon, the 5th Company of the 2nd Battalion of the 2nd Regiment faced Moroccan troops in particularly brutal hand-to-hand combat, characterized by Totenkopf's refusal to take racially inferior prisoners. The division captured 6,088 prisoners between the 17th and 19th of June with minimal losses of its own, and on the 20th of June, its reconnaissance battalion secured the surrender of another 1,300 French troops. On the 22nd of June, France formally capitulated. The division remained in France on occupation duties near the Spanish border for nearly a year. The French campaign demonstrated that Totenkopf, despite its origins, could function as a conventional military formation. Its troops showed notable resilience under fire and determination in combat. However, the losses, 1,152 casualties, 10% of its effective strength, highlighted tactical deficiencies among inexperienced officers who took excessive risks. More concerning was the normalization of criminal conduct, such as the execution of British prisoners at Le Paradis and the systematic refusal to accept the surrender of colonial troops. The expansion of the Waffen-SS after the French campaign brought unforeseen consequences for Eicke's control over his division. Himmler centralized the recruitment and replacement process under Gottlob Berger, head of the Waffen-SS recruitment office. The replacement system within the concentration camps was reconfigured as a general reserve for all SS formations. Eicke lost direct control over the selection of his own reinforcements. This loss of autonomy sparked immediate conflict. During the summer of 1940, Eicke openly disputed with Berger's office over the quality of the replacements received, complaining that they included criminals and racially inferior individuals who would compromise the Totenkopf elite. He ordered his division's doctor and racial expert, Wilhelm Wender, to meticulously examine all recruits and commanders to investigate criminal backgrounds. This scrutiny led Eicke to reject 500 of 700 assigned replacements. Berger, frustrated, pointed out that these men had already passed a racial examination during their initial SS selection and ordered the cessation of these additional evaluations. Eicke, taking advantage of his position as a member of the Old Guard, openly disobeyed, falsely denying the existence of such directives and continuing to reject recruits under various pretexts. Although he temporarily prevailed, this insubordination had consequences. The SS leadership, wary of his growing independence, began to detach him from the concentration camp system, limiting his autonomous influence. This dispute over the purity of replacements marked the beginning of the decline of his authority within the SS hierarchy, a process that would continue until his death on the Russian front. Eicke used the year between the French campaign and the Soviet invasion to profoundly transform his division. He restructured the motorized infantry regiments into Kampfgruppen, battle groups, with greater operational flexibility, incorporated expanded anti-aircraft capabilities, and heavy artillery of 150 mm. He established an exclusive motorized reserve battalion as the primary source of replacements, partially compensating for the loss of access to concentration camp personnel. True to his ideological vision, Eicke implemented an extensive political indoctrination program during the winter of 1940 to 1941, combined with extremely rigorous physical and tactical training. The division was preparing its men specifically for combat in the Soviet Union, emphasizing operations in forests and villages under adverse climatic conditions. The intense program continued until the final weeks before Barbarossa, when the first trains carrying Totenkopf departed for the Soviet border. The division of concentration camp terror was ready for its true trial by fire. The Red Storm, the Totenkopf against the Soviet Colossus. At dawn on the 22nd of June of 1941, the largest land invasion in history began. Over 3 million German soldiers and their allies crossed the Soviet border, launching Operation Barbarossa. The SS Totenkopf Division, after a year of intense preparation, was assigned to Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb's Army Group North, specifically under Erich Hoepner's 4th Panzer Group. The integration was not smooth. Hoepner, who had previously commanded over Totenkopf in France, harbored deep distrust toward Eicke and his division. This animosity stemmed both from personal differences and the institutional rivalry between the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS. Consequently, he relegated Totenkopf to the initial reserve instead of assigning it to the first offensive echelon. Before deployment, Eicke gathered his officers to convey the ideological nature of the impending campaign. He characterized the invasion as an existential struggle between National Socialism and Bolshevism, emphasizing its ruthless character. According to testimonies, Eicke relayed the Führer's order to immediately execute all captured Soviet political commissars, regardless of circumstances. He reminded his men that the Soviets had not signed the Geneva Convention and would not treat prisoners according to Western norms. Totenkopf, he declared, would fight without concessions for the very survival of the German people. Initially assigned to Manstein's 56th Panzer Corps, Totenkopf was tasked with protecting flanks and maintaining contact with the 16th Army during the advance toward the Stalin Line, the Soviet defensive system along the pre-1939 border. The first encounters with the Red Army seemed to confirm Nazi propaganda about Soviet military inferiority, disorganized formations, incompetent officers, and poorly equipped troops. However, this perception changed drastically deeper into Soviet territory. In Dagda and Ostrov, Totenkopf faced coordinated counterattacks supported by heavy KV-1 and KV-2 tanks, against which most German anti-tank weapons proved ineffective. Only concentrated artillery fire could stop them. During these engagements, Eicke himself was severely wounded, temporarily ceding command to SS Brigadeführer Klein-Heisterkamp. The division eventually breached the Stalin Line, but at a severe cost, approximately 10% of its combat strength. Under the interim leadership of Brigadeführer Görlitz, Totenkopf faced its hardest battles in dense forests and swamps near Lake Ilmen. The intricate terrain neutralized German technological advantages and favored Soviet defensive tactics of infiltration and ambush. Despite these difficulties, the division advanced to the Luga Line, the last Soviet defense before Leningrad. There, after initial successes, they encountered the reality of a Soviet military awakening. Massive counterattacks threatened to sever army groups north and center. Totenkopf played a crucial role in the countermaneuver designed by Manstein, inflicting severe losses on Soviet forces and cutting off retreat routes south of Lake Ilmen. By September, Totenkopf's defensive positions near Lushno became the epicenter of intense fighting. The division, significantly weakened, held out against numerically superior forces through extraordinary acts of individual valor. SS Sturmmann Fritz Christen distinguished himself when, after losing all comrades in his anti-tank unit, he operated a PAK-38 cannon alone for 3 full days. When reinforcements arrived, they found Christen surrounded by approximately 100 enemy corpses and 13 destroyed Soviet tanks. Hitler personally awarded him the Knight's Cross. The resistance of units like Totenkopf allowed for a temporary stabilization of the front, but by December of 1941, the German advance had definitively halted. The Russian winter, with temperatures of -40 degrees Celsius, paralyzed equipment not suited for Arctic conditions. Simultaneously, Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov launched a massive counter-offensive near Moscow with Siberian divisions and newly produced T-34 tanks. Army Group Center retreated in disarray, stabilizing only after a direct order from Hitler forbade withdrawals. The Soviet winter offensive also targeted German forces south of Lake Ilmen, attempting to completely sever Army Group North. Detecting enemy buildup, Totenkopf and neighboring units hastily fortified their positions. In January of 1942, the 16th Army, including Totenkopf, was completely encircled in the Demyansk pocket. Soviet forces penetrated deeply, bypassing adjacent German divisions and enclosing approximately 100,000 soldiers in a wooded area southwest of Lake Ilmen. Totenkopf was thrust into the center of the defensive effort, spreading its units across collapsing sectors. Conditions inside the perimeter defined the extreme limits of human endurance. The frozen, swampy terrain prevented proper fortification digging. Land supply lines were completely severed, forcing exclusive reliance on air supply for ammunition, food, and medicine. The Luftwaffe organized a heroic but insufficient airlift. Rations were reduced to basic survival levels. Eicke, partially recovered from his injuries, resumed command, personally coordinating operations. He moved between critical sectors in half-tracked vehicles, frequently under direct fire. His constant presence and uncompromising leadership maintained cohesion among exhausted troops. He established an unforgiving policy. Any unauthorized retreat or surrender was punished by immediate execution, personally supervised. Totenkopf was divided into 2 main battle groups, fighting semi-independently due to limited communications. After personal intervention by Himmler, it received 400 replacements airlifted in. As March came to an end, the division had lost nearly 13,000 men, and 11 of its members had been awarded the Knight's Cross for exceptional acts of valor. In early April of 1942, a German rescue operation finally opened a narrow land corridor to the pocket. Totenkopf forces played a critical role in maintaining this precarious link for weeks, allowing the gradual evacuation of the wounded and the entry of supplies. Fighting continued unabated, and by August, the divisional strength had been reduced to barely 2,700 men. In November of 1942, after nearly a year of uninterrupted combat, the remains of the division were withdrawn from the front and transferred to France for rest and reconstitution. During this period, Totenkopf was elevated to the status of a Panzer Grenadier division, receiving additional armored equipment. The surviving core of hardened veterans formed the foundation for reconstruction, supplemented by fresh but less experienced recruits. Himmler dedicated priority resources to restore the operational capacity of this emblematic formation. Tiger tanks and other advanced weapons were integrated, though significant deficiencies in training and unit cohesion persisted. In early 1943, the division returned to the Eastern Front, joining the newly formed ISS Panzer Corps. Eicke, recognizing shortcomings, secured a brief postponement to consolidate readiness. When it finally reached the front, it joined Manstein's counteroffensive to retake Kharkov, a strategic city lost during the Soviet winter offensive following the disaster at Stalingrad. On the 26th of February of 1943, while conducting aerial reconnaissance in a Fieseler Storch plane to locate a missing panzer regiment, Eicke was shot down by Soviet ground fire near the village of Mikulino. He died instantly, along with the pilot. The news profoundly shocked the division. Soldiers crossed enemy lines to recover his body, a testament to the personal impact he had on his men. This death marked the end of an era for Totenkopf. Eicke was not simply a military commander. He embodied the very spirit of the formation: ideological fanaticism, relentless discipline, and absolute loyalty to National Socialism. Hitler posthumously honored Eicke by renaming Panzergrenadier Regiment 6 as Theodor Eicke and authorizing a commemorative cuff title. After Eicke's death, command fell to Hermann Priess, the division's former artillery commander. Under his leadership, Totenkopf began a gradual transition toward a more conventional military formation, although it never fully shed its original ideological imprint. This evolution reflected the practical needs of the front more than any philosophical change. Survival demanded adaptation to modern combat against an increasingly sophisticated enemy. The division played a decisive role in the final stages of the Third Battle of Kharkov in March of 1943. Together with Das Reich and Leibstandarte, it executed a series of maneuvers that encircled and annihilated Soviet forces blocking the German advance. While Das Reich and Totenkopf drove Soviet units into retreat, Leibstandarte sealed off escape routes, culminating in the destruction of the Soviet 25th Guards Rifle Division in Chugev. This coordinated counterattack temporarily stabilized the southern front and provided Hitler with a needed military success after the Stalingrad disaster. The offensive demonstrated that SS formations retained lethal offensive capability when employed in concert. However, tactical success could not offset the strategic reality. While the Soviets quickly replenished their losses, German resources were dwindling inexorably. Hitler's subsequent decisions revealed a fatal overestimation of these temporary victories. Instead of consolidating sustainable defensive positions, he turned attention toward the Kursk salient, a bulge in the front projecting into German lines, envisioning it as an opportunity for a decisive blow that could reverse the tide of war in the east. Kursk, the last charge of the Totenkopf. In the spring of 1943, after the bloodiest winter on the Eastern Front, the German High Command faced a fundamental strategic dilemma. The catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad had irreversibly shifted the balance of power. The Red Army, growing in confidence and capability, constantly pressed against the overstretched German lines. Should Germany abandon the hard-won territories and establish shortened defensive lines to preserve its dwindling resources, or attempt to regain the initiative through a bold offensive that could reverse the Soviet momentum? Hitler, rejecting any strategy involving voluntary territorial concessions, chose the latter option. The target, the Kursk salient, a 160-kilometer bulge projecting into German positions. By eliminating this prominence through a coordinated attack from the north and south, Hitler hoped to destroy significant concentrations of Soviet forces, shorten the front, and regain strategic initiative. This decision, codified as Operation Citadel, represented a high-stakes gamble with diminishing resources. To concentrate the necessary striking power, the best available divisions, including the SS Panzer formations, were assigned to the offensive. Totenkopf, alongside Leibstandarte and Das Reich, formed the core of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps under Paul Hauser, which would spearhead the attack from the southern sector. During the preparation months, these divisions received absolute priority in new equipment distribution. Totenkopf received Panther and Tiger tanks, armored vehicles, self-propelled artillery, and advanced anti-tank weapons. However, delays in Panther tank production forced the operation's postponement from April to July, giving the Soviets additional time to fortify their defenses. The Soviet High Command, alerted to the impending offensive through British intelligence and a spy network led by Richard Sorge, transformed the Kursk region into an unprecedented fortress. 8 staggered defensive belts were constructed at depths of up to 300 kilometers. Over 400,000 mines were laid, equivalent to 2,400 per square kilometer. 5,000 kilometers of trenches were dug, and 20,000 artillery pieces and rocket launchers positioned. Moreover, the Soviets amassed massive strategic reserves behind the front, including entire armored corps equipped with improved T-34 tanks. In total, over 1.3 million soldiers, 3,600 tanks, and 20,000 artillery pieces awaited the German advance in meticulously prepared defenses. On the 5th of July of 1943, following a massive artillery bombardment, Operation Citadel began. The Totenkopf division, assigned to the central axis of the southern advance, initially made significant progress against the first Soviet defensive line. Its panzer grenadiers, supported by combat engineers, breached minefields while the tanks eliminated machine gun nests and anti-tank positions. However, the depth of Soviet defenses soon imposed an exhausting pace. Every kilometer gained required disproportionate consumption of ammunition, fuel, and lives. The Soviets tenaciously defended each trench, retreating in an orderly fashion to the next prepared position when necessary. Soviet artillery, directed by well-placed observers, relentlessly pounded the German columns. By the third day, Totenkopf had penetrated approximately 15 kilometers, capturing important nodes like the Belgorod-Kursk railway. However, the exposed flank from advancing faster than neighboring units forced pauses to secure vulnerable positions. On the 10th of July, the division crossed the Sel River and established a bridgehead, preparing for what commanders hoped would be a decisive breakthrough. On the 12th of July, the climax occurred when the Soviet High Command launched a massive counter-offensive near Prokhorovka. Approximately 850 Soviet tanks, organized in massive formations, clashed head-on with the 2nd SS Panzer Corps in confined spaces that nullified the German advantage in communications and long-range targeting. Totenkopf faced 2 full Soviet corps in chaotic close-quarters combat. The intensity of the battle surpassed any previous experience. Tanks rammed into other tanks as maneuvering space vanished. Ammunition exploded spectacularly as storage compartments were hit. Dismounted Soviet crews attacked German vehicles with grenades and magnetic mines. Despite being outnumbered approximately 4-1, Totenkopf held its positions through 3 days of uninterrupted combat. The discipline, superior crew training, and technological advantages of German tanks partially compensated for Soviet numerical superiority. However, growing losses in personnel and vehicles constantly eroded its combat capacity. By the 14th of July, Totenkopf and the other SS divisions had suffered devastating losses, including more than half of their tanks and armored vehicles. The offensive had clearly failed. On the 17th of July, Hitler ordered the cancellation of Operation Citadel, redirecting the SS divisions to the Italian front to counter Allied landings in Sicily. In statistical terms, the Totenkopf division had started with approximately 20,000 men. Barely 10,000 combat-effective troops remained after Kursk. Though not technically defeated in a tactical sense, the strategic reality was undeniable. Germany had lost its last chance to regain the initiative on the Eastern Front. The Battle of Kursk, recorded as the largest armored engagement in history, marked a decisive turning point. The mobile offensive warfare that underpinned Germany's early successes definitively gave way to static defense and tactical withdrawals in the face of relentless Soviet pressure. For Totenkopf, Kursk represented the peak of its development as a modern combat formation, demonstrating its ability to execute complex operations and maintain cohesion under extreme pressure. However, these military qualities would not alter the inevitable course of the conflict. While Germany could not replenish its material and human losses, the Soviet Union steadily increased its production of equipment and the mobilization of reserves. The final year of German tactical successes had begun. Immediately after Kursk, without a recovery period, Totenkopf was thrown back into defensive combat. Alongside Das Reich, it took part in a series of desperate actions to contain the Soviet offensive toward Kharkov. These 2 SS divisions played a crucial role as tactical firefighters, rapidly deployed to critical sectors to stabilize collapsing lines. Throughout August and September of 1943, they were used together with the elite Wehrmacht division Großdeutschland as rapid response units, constantly shifting between crisis points. This deployment reflected both their superior tactical capability and the dwindling reserve of effective units available for local counterattacks. In October, they participated in the successful defense of Kryvyi Rog, a critical hub for communications, transport and supply for the Wehrmacht. In November, the formation was officially redesignated as the 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf, reflecting the increase in its armored component. although in reality it remained significantly below its authorized strength. Defensive combat continued without respite through the winter of 1943 to 1944, involving constant withdrawals under unrelenting Soviet pressure. In March of 1944, Totenkopf provided crucial cover for the retreat of Army Group South into Romania. As part of the armored rearguard, it held key positions, allowing less mobile formations to escape toward the Bug River and later to the Carpathian region. These defensive actions, though rarely recognized in official communiques, possibly saved the Wehrmacht from complete annihilation in Ukraine. Totenkopf's role as a last resort force cemented its reputation as one of the most reliable formations available to the German High Command under desperate circumstances. However, each successful withdrawal meant abandoning territory once conquered with blood 2 years earlier, a tangible symbol of the inexorable collapse of Germany's position on the Eastern Front. The twilight of the fanatics, the final defeat of the Totenkopf. The summer of 1944 marked the beginning of the terminal phase for German ambitions in Eastern Europe. The tide of war, temporarily contained through skillful defenses and local counterattacks, turned into an unstoppable flood. The decisive moment came with the launch of the Soviet Operation Bagration on the 22nd of June, exactly 3 years after the start of Operation Barbarossa. This massive offensive, involving more than 2.4 million soldiers and 5,200 tanks, completely destroyed Germany's Army Group Center in Belarus. Within weeks, 28 German divisions were annihilated. The Soviet advance, penetrating 300 kilometers deep and 500 kilometers wide, created enormous gaps that the Germans simply lacked the reserves to close. The catastrophe surpassed Stalingrad in scale, although it received less historical attention afterward. For the Wehrmacht, it represented an irrecoverable loss of irreplaceable veterans and vital equipment. Totenkopf, now part of the 4th Panzer Army, faced the Soviet onslaught in the northern sector. Defending the Grodno area against the Soviet 2nd Tank Army, the division fought at an approximate numerical disadvantage of 10-1. Despite determined resistance, constant Soviet pressure forced a gradual retreat westward. On the 18th of July, completely overrun, Totenkopf withdrew to Warsaw, where it joined the SS Viking Division to defend the eastern approaches to the Polish capital. During this period, Warsaw was preparing for an uprising against the German occupiers. On the 1st of August, as the Red Army approached the eastern banks of the Vistula, the Polish resistance launched the Warsaw Uprising, hoping to coordinate with the Soviet advance. However, Stalin, for political reasons, deliberately halted the offensive, allowing the Germans to crush the rebellion without intervention. Although Totenkopf did not participate directly in the repression within the city, a task assigned primarily to special units like the Dirlewanger Brigade and Rona, it maintained defensive positions in the eastern suburbs, preventing the Soviets from crossing the river to link with the insurgents. This involuntary containment indirectly contributed to the isolation of the Polish resistance, later annihilated by the occupation forces. The front in Warsaw evolved into an extraordinarily bloody battle. Totenkopf faced repeated waves of Soviet assaults, including massive infantry and armored attacks supported by overwhelming artillery. The defensive tactic was to absorb initial offensives in prepared lines, launch limited counterattacks to reclaim lost ground, and pull units back to secondary positions when situations became untenable. Despite the demonstrated tactical effectiveness, the strategic reality was undeniable. Soviet superiority in manpower and materiel rendered every German victory temporary. By late August, Totenkopf had suffered extremely high losses in experienced personnel and irreplaceable equipment. Hitler personally noted Totenkopf's performance, praising its ability to launch effective counterattacks under adverse conditions. However, these residual capabilities did not alter the overall trajectory of the conflict. While Allied forces advanced toward Germany's borders from the west, Soviet offensives swept through Eastern Europe, overrunning Romania, Bulgaria, and much of Hungary. In December of 1944, Totenkopf was deployed, along with the Viking Division, in a failed attempt to break the Soviet siege around Budapest. The Hungarian capital had been isolated following the collapse of Romanian and Bulgarian defenses in previous months. Approximately 70,000 German and Hungarian troops were trapped in the city, doomed to surrender or annihilation. Repeated relief attempts, including Totenkopf's participation, consumed the last armored reserves available in the southern sector without achieving their goal. Eventually, massive Soviet attacks pushed the SS forces into the Bakony forest near Lake Balaton, where they established defensive positions. By March of 1945, Hitler conceived one final desperate offensive, Operation Frühlingserwachen, Spring Awakening. The goal was to recapture Hungary's oil fields and establish a sustainable defensive position protecting Vienna. Totenkopf, along with other elite SS divisions, Leibstandarte, Das Reich and Hohenstaufen, formed the armored core of the attack. These formations, shadows of their former strength but still effective in combat, represented the last significant operational reserve available. The offensive began on the 6th of March in deplorable weather conditions. Constant rain turned the terrain into a swamp, severely limiting the mobility of armored formations. Despite the obstacles, Totenkopf initially advanced 32 kilometers into Soviet-controlled territory, capturing strategic positions and destroying dozens of enemy tanks. However, the deep penetration exposed vulnerable flanks. On the 16th of March, Marshal Tolbukhin's Third Ukrainian Front launched a massive counteroffensive. The numerically superior Soviet forces, supported by constant aerial bombardment, quickly overwhelmed the attacking German formations. Despite Hitler's explicit orders to hold positions at all costs, SS commanders authorized a withdrawal into Austria. Enraged, Hitler ordered that the participating divisions be stripped of their honor cuff titles, a symbolic insult that provoked indignation among veterans who had loyally served through years of desperate combat. By the end of April, with the complete collapse of the Eastern Front, Totenkopf had barely 1,000 combat-effective troops and 6 operational tanks. Under its final commander, Helmuth Becker, the division withdrew toward Linz, Austria. With ammunition and supplies virtually exhausted, prolonged resistance was physically impossible. Hitler's suicide on the 30th of April removed the last psychological barrier to surrender. On the 8th of May of 1945, Germany capitulated unconditionally. Becker surrendered the remnants of Totenkopf to the US Third Army on the condition that the guards from the nearby Mauthausen concentration camp be disarmed. However, the agreement was ignored, and the prisoners were handed over to Soviet custody, for whom the Totenkopf emblem symbolized ultimate criminality. Many were summarily executed. The rest were sent to Soviet labor camps in Siberia, where most perished over the following years. For the eventual survivors, the stigma of having served in a formation marked by war crimes meant decades of legal persecution, social exclusion, and an indelible psychological burden. Heirs of horror, the deadly legacy of the Totenkopf. The legacy of the SS Totenkopf division represents extreme complexity in modern military historiography. On one hand, it demonstrated extraordinary tactical capabilities and exceptional resilience under extreme conditions. A total of 46 soldiers received the Knight's Cross, a distinction reserved for exceptional bravery in combat. However, these military feats remain inextricably linked to its role as a perpetrator of systematic crimes against humanity. The organic connection between Totenkopf and the Nazi concentration camp system was not accidental but foundational. From its inception to its final dissolution, the division maintained an operational philosophy forged in camp administration: absolute contempt for ideological enemies, methodical brutalization as a tool of control, and a racial worldview that denied fundamental humanity to opponents. This fusion of military competence and ideological barbarity is particularly disturbing to contemporary analysts. Charles Sidner, a historian specializing in the Waffen-SS, notes, "Totenkopf forces us to confront the paradox of technically effective soldiers capable of extraordinary acts of valor, who simultaneously engaged in conduct incompatible with Western military traditions." From its earliest actions in Poland to its final retreat in Austria, Totenkopf units perpetrated multiple violations of established laws of war. They systematically executed Soviet prisoners during Barbarossa, particularly political commissars, following the Kommissarbefehl, Commissar Order, issued by High Command. In the Bydgoszcz region during the Polish campaign, Elements of Brandenburg executed approximately 800 civilians in 2 days. In France, in addition to the Le Paradis incident, the division consistently applied selective consideration toward prisoners based on racial criteria. While it accepted the surrender of white French soldiers, it systematically massacred Moroccan and Senegalese colonial troops, deemed racially inferior. Subsequent investigations documented Totenkopf's participation in brutal reprisals against civilian populations suspected of supporting partisans in Soviet-occupied territories. Numerous villages in Belarus and Ukraine were completely razed under scorched earth policies as they retreated before Soviet advances. In later trials, particularly in the Russia trial at Nuremberg, evidence was presented of Totenkopf medical personnel's involvement in illegal eugenic programs, including forced sterilizations and racial selection of occupied populations. The division maintained operational ties with the Einsatzgruppen, execution squads, during the early phases of Operation Barbarossa. Fritz Knöchlein, the officer responsible for the Le Paradis massacre, was eventually captured, tried by a British military tribunal in Hamburg, and executed in January of 1949. During the trial, he argued that he acted in reprisal because British soldiers were using prohibited expanding bullets, a defense rejected for lack of evidence. The brutality of the incident had provoked outrage even among contemporary Wehrmacht officers. However, most Totenkopf members never faced individual judicial accountability for their wartime actions. Several factors contributed to this impunity. The overwhelming scale of the German collapse made individualized prosecution difficult, systematic destruction of records in the war's final stages, and the frequent absence of surviving witnesses who could provide specific testimony. In general terms, the entire Waffen-SS was declared a criminal organization at the Nuremberg trials, a classification that automatically applied to all Totenkopf members. For surviving veterans, the consequences were severe: permanent exclusion from military benefits, public association bans, legal restrictions on displaying related symbols, and significant employment barriers in post-war Germany. Modern historians identify Totenkopf as an extreme case of ideological influence on a conventional military unit. While other Waffen-SS divisions eventually evolved into more pragmatic formations, Totenkopf retained its doctrinal core to the end. Political education remained a formal component of training even in 1944, when most units had abandoned such practices in response to tactical urgencies. Contemporary military analysts highlight 3 defining characteristics: iron discipline. Totenkopf demonstrated outstanding cohesion and combat capability even under catastrophic conditions like the Demyansk pocket. Ideological fanaticism, absolute obedience to orders, regardless of moral content, enabled the systematic commission of atrocities against civilians and prisoners. Tactical adaptability. In strictly military terms, its performance in complex defensive operations and local counterattacks consistently exceeded the Wehrmacht's average standards after 1943. Military historian Martin Kuppers observes, "What made Totenkopf effective as a fighting unit, a us versus them mindset, willingness to make extreme sacrifices, absolute confidence in the legitimacy of the cause, simultaneously enabled its participation in mass crimes. These were not separable traits, but different manifestations of the same fundamental ethos." In the decades that followed, some veterans of the Totenkopf attempted to reconstruct the narrative by separating the supposed honorable military aspects from isolated excesses. They organized reunions, published memoirs, and defended their service as conventional soldiers fulfilling a patriotic duty. One veteran interviewed in a later documentary declared, "We have nothing to be ashamed of and fought our enemies honorably, with honor, courage, and faith." However, systematic academic research based on recovered archives, contemporary testimonies, and operational documentation has conclusively established that the brutality was neither accidental nor isolated. It was a central component of the division's operational identity. The indoctrination received directly encouraged criminal conduct against those categorized as enemies of the Reich, and the division consistently operated under principles that disregarded established international conventions. For the victims of Totenkopf's actions, both military and civilian, the legacy remains painfully clear. Testimonies from British survivors of Le Paradis described the brutal indifference with which they were executed after surrendering. Polish survivors of the Warsaw Uprising recalled how the presence of SS formations, including elements of Totenkopf, on the outer perimeter, contributed to the isolation that doomed the city to destruction. Communities in the Soviet Union where the division operated preserved across generations the memory of brutal reprisals, summary executions, and the destruction of entire villages. For these victims and their descendants, debates about military competence are entirely secondary to the reality of the suffering inflicted. Totenkopf exemplifies the central dilemma in studying the Third Reich, the impossibility of separating the conventional aspects from the criminal components. It was not merely a combat division that occasionally committed excesses, but a direct extension of the Nazi terror apparatus brought to the battlefield. Its tactical effectiveness served precisely to implement policies that were fundamentally criminal under international law. Modern historiography has consistently rejected attempts to romanticize or normalize the Waffen-SS as a mere conventional military force. The historical evidence clearly establishes its integral role in the practical implementation of genocidal policies. Totenkopf, with its direct roots in the concentration camp system, represents a particularly explicit case of this integration. For future generations, the Totenkopf division remains a powerful reminder of the inherent dangers of the complete subordination of military ethics to extremist ideology. Its history illustrates how military institutions can become instruments of terror when they abandon the moral and legal restraints that distinguish legitimate warfare from organized criminality. Today, any comprehensive analysis of Totenkopf must simultaneously acknowledge the reality of its tactical capability and the fundamentally criminal nature of its mission and conduct. This uncomfortable duality resists simplification, but demands direct confrontation if we are to draw meaningful lessons from one of the darkest chapters in modern military history. The skull and crossbones emblem, which predated Nazism but was appropriated and transformed by the regime, acquired through Totenkopf's actions an entirely new meaning. It no longer symbolized valor in the face of death, but the regime that industrialized death itself. When survivors were asked about the insignia's meaning, many maintained the traditional military interpretation: readiness for personal sacrifice. However, for millions affected by Nazi policies, the symbol became permanently associated with systematic terror. Examining the full trajectory of the Totenkopf division, from concentration camps to European battlefields, reveals a microcosm of the Nazi regime itself, a lethal combination of organizational efficiency, ideological fanaticism, and calculated brutality. Its tactical successes and strategic failures reflect a broader pattern of German warfare. Its criminal conduct illustrates the inevitable consequences when a military institution abandons fundamental moral restraints. The history of the Totenkopf continues to generate intense debate among modern military historians. While some technical analysts study its tactical innovations and its ability to operate effectively under extreme conditions, social historians and Holocaust scholars emphasize the continuity between its methods in concentration camps and its behavior in combat zones. For contemporary society, the central lesson remains clear: technical excellence and organizational competence, devoid of an ethical foundation, inevitably lead to barbarism, regardless of the rhetoric used to justify it. The Totenkopf division, with its strange blend of exemplary military discipline and systematic criminality, remains a historical warning about the inherent dangers when armed forces are fully subordinated to extremist ideology. Most of the men who served in the Totenkopf did not survive the war. For those who did, the legacy remained inescapable. Some attempted to rebuild anonymous lives in post-war Germany, concealing their connection to the stigmatized unit. Others maintained contact through semi-clandestine veterans associations where they cultivated a sanitized version of their history. Regardless of later personal narratives, the historical record stands. The SS Totenkopf division represented the most explicit manifestation of the fusion between the professional military apparatus and the Nazi ideological program. Its members were not merely unfortunate soldiers trapped in the machinery of war, but voluntary participants in a vision that explicitly rejected traditional humanitarian constraints in the conduct of hostilities. As we conclude this analysis of Germany's most infamous division, we must remember that the study of controversial military formations serves a greater purpose than simple fascination with technical or tactical aspects. Authentic military history must directly confront the ethical dimensions of armed conflict, recognizing that how societies wage war fundamentally reflects their core values. Totenkopf, born in the terror of the concentration camps and dissolved in catastrophic defeat, remains an enduring testament to the horrors human beings can inflict when convinced of their absolute moral superiority over dehumanized enemies. Its history must be studied precisely because it illustrates the extreme consequences that arise when societies abandon the fundamental principles that separate legitimate warfare from institutionalized terrorism. In the Russian steppes, the Polish forests, and the French fields where Totenkopf fought, silent memorials remember the victims of its path. These silenced voices, more than strategic analyses or tactical debates, constitute the true legacy of a division whose emblem became synonymous with the darkest side of modern warfare.